Now, as you all know, today's motion is "This pandemic shows East Asia is ready to lead." The coronavirus pandemic arrived in many countries around 1 year ago and required them all to respond immediately to safeguard the health and lives of its citizens. The challenges that the governments had to face included not only health issues, but to a large degree also legal, logistical, as well as communication matters. These governance challenges occupy many of the European and American countries up to this date, including harder or softer lockdowns in most of them, while several East Asian countries have seen almost no infections, nor deaths, nor lockdowns in many, many months. Is this just coincidence? Is it the result of differences in culture or political systems? Or might it be a turning point into a future where East Asia leads the world, not just in addressing a pandemic, but also in addressing other global challenges? This is the question we are going to be debating today. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our teams, and I would ask the panelists to now turn back on their video and audio so we can see them. Arguing for the motion, Se-Woong Koo, who is the founder of Korea Exposé, an independent media outlet that operated from 2014 to 2019 with a focus on the Korean Peninsula. He has also contributed regularly to the New York Times opinion section, Al Jazeera, and the BBC World Service, and is currently working on a book about contemporary South Korean society. Welcome, Se-Woong. He's joining us today from Stuttgart. Joining him arguing in favor of the motion is Bernhard Bartsch, who is a senior expert for China and Asia Pacific at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and a former East Asia correspondent based in Beijing for daily newspapers Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Frankfurter Rundschau, and Berliner Zeitung, among others. Bernhard is joining us today from his house in Berlin, where his children are making lunch for him while he is speaking. Arguing on the other side against the motion, Valérie Niquet, who is the head of the Asia department at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, a senior fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs, and a lecturer at Keio University on Sino-Japanese relations. She's also a consultant for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs Center, Perspective and Strategy, and the Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite. Valérie is currently in Tokyo. Thank you very much for joining us, arguing against this motion. And joining her is Angela Stanzel, associate in the Asia Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Before that, she was a senior policy fellow of Institut Montaigne and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Without further ado, I would like now to hand over to Se-Woong to start with his 4 minutes of opening remarks. Se-Woong, please, the floor is yours.
So will East Asia lead the way beyond this pandemic? That's the question we're addressing today. But that we must ask this at all actually shows that East Asia in a leading role on the global stage is an alien, improbable notion perhaps to some people. Well, from my position as an Asian living in Europe, I can say that East Asia is already leading in many ways. And the COVID crisis has shown just where the gap between East Asia and Europe lies. In Germany, where I'm currently living, we have been in a lockdown of various forms for nearly 4 months, with the possibility of an extension. In South Korea, where I come from and which I visited 3 times during this crisis, there has never been a lockdown of this kind. People go out almost freely, most businesses are permitted to operate, subways and buses are full. It's because South Korea did from the beginning what Germany failed to do. Timely shutdown of borders, immediate quarantine of potential carriers, effective contact tracing, and a copious amount of testing. Yet we hear from detractors of East Asia's success that this could only happen because of authoritarianism. A state's heavy-handed restrictions on freedom are willingly accepted by a docile public in Asia, whereas that approach could never be applied in the so-called free democratic West. Well, such an argument misses a very important point, that with the exception of China, East Asia consists of free democratic nations. In the case of South Korea, the country's infectious disease policy is grounded in actual experience of previous pandemics, especially the MERS crisis in 2015. Laws were passed then through democratic institutions with popular consent, so that the government could increase its information gathering capabilities should a similar pandemic arise. At the same time, we have seen that German media find faults with South Korea's quarantine app, which tracks the location of those under quarantine, as the name implies. Yet far too many German news reports mistakenly present this app to be the equivalent of Germany's Corona Warn app, and have suggested that all South Koreans somehow download this and are tracked real-time 24/7, which is far from the truth. This kind of reporting itself tells us something about the current European imagination of East Asia, that we, submissive Asians, are all victims of a tyrannical state. So improbable it seems that backward East Asia could actually do better than enlightened Europe without resorting to some draconian, undemocratic means. The reality is far simpler. South Korea has dealt more effectively with coronavirus through good governance and also digitalization. Whereas in Germany, the so-called model of Europe, a simple contact tracing app took months to develop and was still prone to errors. Rollout of COVID tests was met with unacceptable delays. Last May, I was tested for COVID at a South Korean hospital, got my result in 8 hours via a text message. In August, I was tested at Stuttgart Airport and received the result 2 weeks later by mail. Even as late as last week, there were media reports that Germany has distributed millions of faulty masks and that all of them now have to be withdrawn and replaced. This kind of error is inconceivable in the South Korean context. East Asia's successes are grounded in fundamentals, hard as it may be to believe. A case in point, just last week, German radio host Matthias Matuschek on Bavarian broadcaster Bayern 3 compared the coronavirus to South Korean boy band BTS, which is arguably the biggest musical act of our time. He has since apologized, but his remark betrayed two things: racism, as well as profound discomfort with the notion that Asia can lead the world or be the best of anything. Yet evidence is quite clear. It isn't just that East Asia will lead the way. East Asia is already leading the world in many ways. Thank you.
I will focus on two countries, Japan and China, that are quite different from what is happening in South Korea. I will argue that the question of leadership is not cannot be reduced to the perception of power projected particularly by China during that crisis. China is indeed powerful. It has apparently succeeded in with growth figure above 2% if we stick to the economy after that year of pandemic. So this is indeed a big success apart from the medical or pandemic problems itself. However, the lack of transparency raises question about that success. At the economic level, China cannot lead by itself. It needs the outside world. It needs Europe. It needs the United States. China, the second point is China and Japan are essentially, and this is my main argument against self-centered, and this has been increased by the COVID-19 crisis. The question of the political regime in the case of China particularly is extremely important. China motivation is essentially internal stability and survival of the political regime. Its external action depend on these objectives. Its position on multilateralism and norms, for instance, are determined by this priority and not by an adhesion to global principles, including global issues like, for instance, climate change that are very important today. Japan, on its side, is of course a democracy. It is different from China, but COVID-19 also led to a withdrawal in spite of constant affirmation of an adhesion to concepts like shared values, like-minded countries. The priority for Japan remains at the political level very internally focused. On the question of engagement on global responsibilities remains also very limited. And the third argument is, but not the least, it's that the measures adopted to deal with the pandemic in China and in Japan cannot be a model for Europe or for the United States or the rest of the world. Of course, in China, numbers are good, but for very specific reasons related to the capacity of the Chinese regime to use coercion, domestic surveillance without any check and balance and control of the liberty of the population. It means that we have, again, a lack of transparency about real figures, and also that the pandemic itself was, in my view, the result of the political system. On one side, you have a globalization where China is at the center, but also a system with no control, a lot of corruption, and that can lead to new pandemics. So in that sense, for China, it's very difficult to become a leader or a model for the rest of the world. For Japan, an island country, it decided to close itself completely. And if Japan escaped a lot of victims to the pandemics, actually it was essentially because it has not been hit by a large wave, but the measures taken themselves in Japan are extremely limited, with very few testing, for instance, and a lot of problems with hospitals taking in charge people with COVID-19. So for these reasons, I think it's problematic to see Asia or these two big countries in Asia as leaders for the future.
Thank you very much, Valérie. I dare say that was incredibly well argued and very lively, despite us not having a video feed. So thank you very much for that. Let's hear from Bernhard Bartsch in Berlin for his rebuttal, arguing in favor of the motion. Bernhard.
Thank you, Nico. Indeed, to Western ears, the idea of this motion that East Asia could lead the world is a provocation. We are socialized in Europe and the US to feel that we have the best systems politically, economically, and socially. But this pandemic brings us to a moment of truth where we really have to admit that the times when the West was the leading power are really over. Which, of course, and I've heard that in Valérie's statement already, is a very frustrating moment to Western political minds, that 30 years after the end of the Cold War, it could be an authoritarian Communist Party-led dictatorship leading the world is indeed the biggest provocation thinkable to the Western mind. But let's cool our frustration for a moment and think about what it means to be a leading country. Valérie just said that China cannot lead by itself. It needs Europe and the US. Well, what is it that leading countries do? Leading countries, leaders in general, make things happen. Leaders are the ones that create a dynamic that others have to react to and cannot ignore. Some will follow, some will try to resist, but it's the leading powers that create the dynamic that changes the world. Now, this dynamic for the last couple of years has already come from China. I don't need to retell the story here because you all know it, but this pandemic has made it particularly visible that really the change in the world these days is coming from East Asia and mainly from China, its dominant power. While in the West, we are still struggling with COVID-19, people in China are leading more or less normal lives. While the West is in the deepest recession since World War II, China has considerable growth. It's going to add once or twice the GDP of Switzerland this year alone. While Western countries are turning inwards, China is turning outwards with vaccine diplomacy, by establishing free trade zones like RCEP, and also by flying fighter jets towards Taiwan. Now, here's the important point. When I acknowledge China's leadership, it does not mean that I support it or that I root for it. Leading countries do not necessarily lead the world to a better place. But if we believe that free, open, transparent societies, democratic societies that are dominant in the West, but that also exist, of course, in Japan, in Korea, and Taiwan, if this model of society should really still be the model that leads the world, we first have to acknowledge our shortcomings, that we have to acknowledge that at the moment, it is not us leading the world, it is not us bringing a new dynamic to the world, it is East Asia. The idea that at this moment, the West is leading the world is not a provocation, it's purely a delusion.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. And now let's hear finally also from Angela Stanzel arguing with her rebuttal against the motion. Angela, please.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by saying that our motion is not that the West is the leader to the world. This is about whether Asia is the leader to the world in this crisis. So if we are against this motion, then we don't automatically say that it means the West is a model in this crisis. To come back a little bit to Valérie's point, what makes a leader? It has to be a model that most countries can see for themselves and also have the means to copy what other countries are doing. So again, if we look at the differences that we heard in the beginning between Asian countries and, for example, European countries, there are huge differences. Even if we leave China on the side as an authoritarian state, even if we only look at the democracies such as South Korea, Japan, but also India or Taiwan. Our biggest difference that we have been also struggling with in Germany, for example, is individual liberties, the right to privacy, data protection. Even in a domestic debate, this has been a huge issue. How far can you go in imposing measures in order to reduce infections or to save lives for the sake of basic human rights, what Germans consider as their basic human rights. And this includes the issue of contact gathering, information sharing. If we take the example of China, then it also includes CCTV cameras and immigration controls and so on. The other issue here is the issue of shutdown. We heard also the argument of an early shutdown, but in particular Europe and in particular Germany is a hub in many ways. It's a trading hub, it's a traveling hub. How do you shut down a hub like this? It's, for example, quite different just by its geostrategic location than Australia and New Zealand, who also have succeeded combating the crisis by shutting down very early on. So as a leader, you have to also have the means to combat a crisis. And there are, in that regard, also differences. We did not in the West or in Europe had the experience of SARS, which means we did not store millions of masks in the past 20 years. Even in Germany, I can tell you from my own mother, she doesn't even have a mobile phone. That's also a big difference, I believe, to many Asian countries, such as India or China, where it is natural for everyone to have a mobile phone and also a smartphone. We have many people who don't have that. So how do you do this kind of contact gathering and data protection and so on, data gathering without having the means? So we have to look at these very big differences. First of all, the differences in the nature of our systems and what people believe are their basic rights and whether they are willing to give them up. And secondly, whether you have the means to actually copy what Asian countries have done in this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you everybody for your great opening statements. And I want to commend everybody also for perfectly keeping the time that we set out for you. That is not easy. Se-Woong, I wanted to start with you because in your opening statement, you had some pretty remarkable comparisons from, taking a test in South Korea versus taking a test in Germany. And this seems to me like saying a lot about just state capacity, specifically when dealing with this pandemic, when trying to introduce new rules quickly. And I was wondering whether you had an answer of why the South Korean state in this specific regard has proven so much more capable. And I think there can be little debate that it has than Germany or really any of the other European or quote unquote Western nations. So what is it that made South Korea better equipped to deal with this than we were here in Europe?
Well, one thing that we must point out is the difference in the capacity of the healthcare infrastructure. One thing that I think everybody in Europe can acknowledge is just how long it takes to see a medical specialist. And this is simply not the case in Korea, where there is a very high number of specialists as well as primary care providers. And the sheer number of hospitals that are present in the capital, in the surrounding region, these resources were mobilized to address the impending threat of the pandemic, so that when testing was made necessary, it could be handled through these private infrastructure under the direction of the state. And this must definitely be credited to the amount of investment that has been made in the healthcare industry in Korea over the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you. Let me now sort of put this to Angela and Valérie. I think, to me, Se-Woong and Bernhard made a very, very good point. And I think especially the example of South Korea, which both of you haven't specifically addressed, seems very, very obvious. So why exactly could it not be that what South Korea did, maybe to an extent what China did, but maybe to an extent what Japan did in this pandemic, is giving us a glimpse of the future? You seem very skeptical that the positive experiences that East Asian countries make during this pandemic would tell us anything about their capacity for leadership in the future, but it's not entirely clear to me why that is.
Maybe I will answer that one first briefly. First, as is very visible through the previous intervention, it's extremely difficult to speak of Asia as just one block. You have many different situations. China, again, is very specific because of the characteristic of its political regime. And for me, the characteristics of that political regime, of course, allowed China to put a lead on the pandemic inside China in a way, but again, we do not have all the information needed, as was demonstrated by the recent complicated visit by the World Health Organization to China itself, with very poor access to real information. And then, because of the regime, China is in a way responsible for that kind of pandemics. And my worry is that it could start again with another kind of pandemics, because this is related to, again, poor transparency, the lack of legal system, information being controlled by the power in order not to have negative consequences for the regime itself, plus the globalization where China is very important. So it means that this has not been solved. And in that way, China cannot be a leader. As for Japan, actually, in Japan, you cannot get very easily a test. It's extremely difficult to be tested in Japan. So luckily, there are not a big number of cases in Japan, but you cannot be tested in Japan as you want. It's completely different from South Korea. You have also a number of problems related to COVID beds, hospital beds, because 80% are private hospitals, and these private hospitals are very reluctant to open beds to COVID-19 patients. So you see, you have many very different situations regarding the different countries in Asia. So in that sense, answering to the question asked, can Asia lead? I think no, Asia cannot lead for many different reasons, and certainly not the most important power in Asia, that is China. Thank you very much.
And you raised, I think, a very crucial point, and I want to get back to this afterwards, is of the question of, is there something as East Asia? Is there's a homogeneous space, which you say it's not. Let's stick with China for a moment. Bernhard, Valérie said in her opening statement, which I thought was a very good point, she said that China doesn't really want to lead, I think, if I understood correctly, Valérie. China is self-centered, inward-looking. The main goal of China's leadership is regime stability. There is absolutely no reason why China would go out and want to be an example for the world, as long as it can, continue to grow and develop and exert influence. So where, Bernhard, do you see the evidence that, assuming that China has the capacity to be a global leader, that it even wants to be a global leader?
I think it's very obvious to see that China in recent years under Xi Jinping has started to have the ambition of global leadership from all the statements and documents that they have. Only take the Belt and Road Initiative. That is a global geopolitical initiative. Now, again, what does it mean to lead? Obviously, China is not a model for us in Europe or the US, but China is 20% of the world population. The West is another 20%, which leaves 60%. Another 20% is India. Now, India is moving under Modi much more towards a Chinese-style authoritarian system. Not that they're good friends with China, but it's a much more authoritarian system. Democracy is not on the rise in India. It's not on the rise in South America. It's not on the rise in Africa. So the battleground, so to say, is these 60%. And these 60% get a very good value proposition from China in many different ways. The Belt and Road is one. Vaccine diplomacy is one. China, and here you can see how they really want to lead. China has sent vaccines to over 100 countries. Vaccines that they don't use back home. They want to impress the rest of the world and show them their capabilities, which is more important for them than first getting everyone in China vaccinated against COVID-19. Now, if that is not a claim to leadership, I don't know what is. And if this does not fall onto very fertile ground in the 60% of the world that are up for grabs, then I also don't see which reality you honestly live in.
Thank you. Angela, both Valérie and yourself made the argument, and Valérie said it again before, that there's really no such thing as Asia, and there probably isn't even such a thing as East Asia. And the countries that we usually kind of lump in there, and we've discussed about today, China, Japan, South Korea, have all been successful in their ways in responding to the pandemic, but all in very, very different ways. But yet, it does seem striking to me when we look at the world map that there is a strong concentration of countries that have been successful dealing with this pandemic, clusters of in one place of the globe, and then everybody else is doing not so well. So is it really just coincidence? Or would you not have to admit that there is, whatever we want to say it is, but there is something specific about this East Asian region in the world that seems to have made it more successful in dealing with the pandemic?
I don't think it's a coincidence. I think the biggest difference between Asia and the rest of the world is that Asia had the experience already, and some countries prepared very good for another SARS case, which has happened. Now, some countries did not so much, but I think that's the biggest difference between Asia and the rest of the world, including the West. So I think there are elements that we can look at and we can copy. And we have already also done that. Different countries around the world, including in Europe, have very closely observed and analyzed the measures that South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, also Hong Kong, by the way, have taken, but have also come to the conclusion that a lot of these measures cannot be copied just the same way as the Asian countries. We heard earlier also the example of the Corona app and the difference between Germany and South Korea. I think this is a prime example that shows you that we have kind of taken the idea, but we had to adjust it to our own society and our own priorities.
Thank you. I want to turn to audience questions, and there's one here that I'm going to read and that we can look into. So the question is, how much of the difference between the Asia and European response to the pandemic is due to the collectivist, less individualist nature of Asian populations as opposed to the European populations, and therefore their greater willingness to do what their government instructs without question? Now, Se-Woong, I want to start with you. You're from South Korea. Some South Koreans I know sometimes take a little bit issue with being labeled as a collectivist society. So let's maybe start by hearing your thoughts on whether this distinction of a more collectivist society in East Asia versus more individual society in Europe, whether you would even agree with the notion, and then we can get into how that has shaped pandemic response.
I think this is a fantastic question. In fact, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there were statements about the fact that Asians are used to wearing masks, and that's why they do it, even at the beginning of the Corona crisis. And and some actually argue that Asians wear masks in order to protect the public from becoming infected, which was such an absurd notion to me, as well as many of my friends in Asia. Nobody I know in Asia would wear a mask to protect other people. Everybody would wear it to protect themselves. So that kind of misunderstanding already shows very clearly this assumption of collectivism on the part of Asians, which simply is false. At the same time, there have been many points raised in East Asian cyberspace, as well as from East Asian media, that there's something very selfish or individualistic in the way Europeans are behaving with regard to COVID. They point to the illegal raids that have taken place in different European capitals, especially the ones around New Year in France were quite shocking to especially Korean readers that I was following. So yes, I suppose you could draw a certain comparison in terms of culture. That is something that we cannot ignore, even though I do dispute the notion that Asians are collectivist as a whole.
Thank you. That was a fantastic, very, very nuanced response you gave there. Let me put the question also maybe to Valérie from the opposing team in terms of the sort of the cultural differences and how much they are responsible for influencing the pandemic response.
I think that in terms of cultural response, and this is something that you can see also in the divide between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, you have far less physical contacts in Asia. For instance, you do not shake hands, you do not hug that much, except maybe between close friends. In Japan, you bow. People are not touching each other, even when everything is very crowded. You try not to be invasive of the personal space of someone else. So this, of course, may help. There is a very high sense, at least in Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, of hygiene, which is washing your hands, and that kind of thing is very ingrained, maybe much more than, let's say, in France, I would say. And also there is another thing that maybe we did not focus on is the health condition of the people. There are far less people overweight in Asia, particularly in South Korea, Japan, and even China. I think that a lot of conditions related to high consumptions of meat and so on that you can find in our own countries, and that can lead to high level of comorbidities is less present, in my view, in East Asia than in Europe. So that also might have helped in having less number of people with grave manifestation of the COVID-19 than in our countries. And I think also of countries like the United States or Brazil, for instance.
Thank you very much. Angela, I wanted to put a question to you also from the audience, which I think is a really, really good one. The question is, do you think the West would be more open to accepting leadership styles from East Asian democracies rather than China? So do you see, you've argued against sort of there being such a thing as an East Asian sort of leadership, but do you think there is an opening, so to speak, for East Asian democracies, whether that's Japan or South Korea or others, to sort of bring themselves into the global fore much more strongly after this pandemic and have a stronger voice, because they would be met with less resistance than obviously an attempt at Chinese leadership?
I think that Western or European countries would be more comfortable with it to have that kind of discussion rather than discussing what Bernhard has started, China as a leader. But nevertheless, I think to reduce even the Asian countries to a bunch of democracies that we can just follow because they are democracies is too simple. Looking at India, we also heard before, India is moving more towards the China direction, even though it's still a democracy. But even before Modi, it was a very, very complicated democracy and probably not really a model for European countries, for example, or other Western countries. I think there is much rather the notion that democracies should be a model to the rest of the world as compared to authoritarian states or countries that move towards authoritarianism. So to speak, the alliance of democracies, as some of Western leaders have proposed it also in recent years.
Thank you very much. Maybe one more question also from the audience, Bernhard. And we talked a little bit about this before. Maybe the question is, can it really be inferred from a country's or region's successful management of a pandemic that such country or region has the ability to lead the world as such? And I think that's a fair point. We've talked a lot about pandemic response, and we've kind of had this hypothesis when we started this conversation that this might be a signal of a change. But Bernhard, maybe you can talk a little bit more about signs that you see for an East Asia that is ready and willing to lead that are not its pandemic response. You've talked about China, but perhaps there are things outside of China that you see that give you confidence or certainty that this region will take on more of a leadership role in the future than it has in the past.
Well, for one, I would argue that to lead doesn't mean to present the model that everyone else then directly copies. To lead means to create the dynamic that others think about and react to. And if you go beyond China, if you look at Asia generally, then I think the important trend to look at today is the development of technology, the openness to digitalization. And there, not only China, but a lot of other Asian countries are just much faster. They have the advantage that many of them are developing and leapfrogging certain developments. But in future technologies, which has played an important role in fighting this pandemic, but it's not only that. There, Asia really is the region to turn to. And that is why in the West, our companies are increasingly looking to Asia, because that is where the markets are, that is where most people are, and that is where most development in these areas is going to be. That has nothing directly to do with this pandemic. It has something to do with the center of gravitation of the global economy. It is where the most growth and the most development is. And that happens to be East Asia for the next decades.
Let me pick this up and return as we come to the end of this Q&A part to something that Valérie said at the very beginning in her opening statement. And we talked about, you said, China and Japan don't even want to lead. And we've talked about this for a little bit before, but I do want to put the question to you. What, in your view, would have to change so that these two countries, or especially China, would actually want to start leading? So how stable of a condition is this unwillingness for global leadership actually? Or is it something, as Bernhard has argued a couple of times now, that we already see changing?
I think that China doesn't want to take the responsibilities of what a global leader would be. Of course, China has a very dynamic diplomacy. Some would even say aggressive or assertive diplomacy, particularly towards developing countries or Eastern Europe or other parts of the world. But this is also very much related to its priorities. And its priorities is to build a kind of system of support or alliance. But the main objective, again, is to get some support for the survival of its own regime. And it is not very much interested in global issues that are not directly related to that priority. So I think that in that sense, in spite of the fact that China is extremely active, it doesn't mean that it wants to really be a global leader tackling important issues important to the world. I would also add that assertiveness of China's diplomacy on different formats like the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. First, you see some limitations, even with countries like Pakistan, very close to China, for instance, but also it led to many backlashes. And we saw that the image on the soft power of China has declined actually this year instead of being increased, even in countries very close to China and related to China, like, for instance, in Southeast Asia. So I think that all these demonstrate that China has its own logic, it follows its own priorities, but doesn't want to be I would say a positive leader for the world.
Thank you very much. And of course, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said with the challenges that China has faced throughout this year with much more sort of headwind on the international stage. But we've come to the end, unfortunately, already of the Q&A part, and it's now time for closing statements. Every panelist, again, has 2 minutes to summarize their position and make a final plea to you, the audience, to vote in favor or against the motion. The order is the same as the beginning, which means, Se-Woong, you are starting and you have 2 minutes on the clock.
Thank you. Well, we have heard the opposition argue that being the leader of the world means presenting an ideal. And I'm afraid to say that even I do not see East Asia being the leader in this regard. However, the question we need to answer is whether East Asia will lead, and does it lead? And I think we can safely say that, in fact, it does. And I don't mean in every sense of the word, but in some things, much as Europe does, much as the US does. It's simply that we need to acknowledge that Asia has also reached its leadership capacity when it comes to some things, especially in addressing things such as the COVID pandemic. We've heard from Angela that we cannot think about applying the Asian model in Europe because, if, for example, in Europe, we have people without mobile phones, let alone smartphones. Well, it's not because of technology that South Korea was able to create a national distribution system for masks when there was a shortage. It's not because of smartphones that you have 74 people tracing cases of COVID in South Korea in a region with 25 million people, when in fact in Bayern, in Germany, we have 6 different health offices doing the same and complaining of being overwhelmed. We've heard about freedom. In Asia, this is an attack on freedom. We cannot have attack on freedom in Europe Well, let me ask you, our audience members in Europe, do you feel free now? Do you feel free in this lockdown, not being able to go out freely, with curfews at night in some cases, only going to shop for food, and having to work from home because there's no other way? Well, I'm not sure if this is really freedom either, but it is up to you to decide whether Asia is less free. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Let's move it right along to Valérie for her closing statement arguing against the motion.
Well, I would argue again that in order to lead the world, if there is such a notion of being a world leader, maybe we are past that time and there are no world leader anymore, be it Asia or China, or certainly not China. I think that the democratic model actually, in spite of its many difficulties, I think it will win. In the end, in spite of the difficulties we see now with the COVID-19, I am sure that it is much more adaptable on the longer term to tensions through debates and discussions. And of course, countries like Korea, South Korea, or Japan, or Taiwan, or region like Taiwan are, of course, also very democratic. But we are used to debate everything. Maybe it slows decision-making process, but it also what makes it much more acceptable on the longer term.
Thank you very, very much. That was short and concise. And I'm going to pass it along to Bernhard Bartsch, arguing in his closing statement for the motion.
Leading is about being successful. You don't only choose to be a leader, you are a leader because others follow you, and others follow East Asian countries in many respects because they are successful. And this pandemic is one of those moments in history where this very diffuse term of leadership really boils down to one issue that all other issues are secondary to and sorted around this. How you tackle this pandemic shows your capabilities, and tackling it well shows that you have capabilities which are adaptable in all other areas too. So because we're virtually in Switzerland here, let me translate this question of which side of the motion you should vote on into the Roger Federer language of tennis. If 2020 was the first set of a tennis match, then China started badly, but quickly picked up its game and won the first set 6-2, 6-3. Now we're in the second set. We in the West are playing very badly. We are making a lot of forced errors. China is leading. And if we don't turn this around very quickly, then game is going to be over very quickly. Now, losing this match is not a tragedy. There's going to be a next match. If we prepare well, if we learn from our mistakes, we are able to win the next match, win it for democracy and open, free societies. But for the time being, to vote in this match, unless you see the West really winning this, you have to admit, like Roger Federer famously did, that the guy played better on that day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, a very clever way of trying to winning over a Swiss audience to bring up Roger Federer. Let's finally hear from Angela Stanzel arguing in her closing statement against the motion, which is this pandemic shows East Asia is ready to lead. Angela, please.
Thank you very much. I have two final points. First of all, I do still feel free even in my home office. Why? Because I'm not being traced. I'm not being followed by CCTV cameras. And because I know that my government and also other governments in Europe are trying a very, very difficult balancing act between, on the one hand, protecting me from the virus, and on the other hand, keeping my liberties alive. My second point is taking again Bernhard's point on China and what defines China as a leader, and his example of the vaccine diplomacy, which, yes, China went out into the world to sell its vaccine, but we are not going to be vaccinated by the Chinese vaccine in Europe. Why? Because it doesn't fulfill our standards. It is not a model for us. That's why we are producing our own vaccines and relying on other vaccines. And if we take this example further, then we can see that it's also not Asian vaccines or precisely the Chinese vaccine that is going around the world. Yes, in some parts of the world, but not everywhere. It's also the Western vaccine. So for me, again, coming back to our original argument, there may be elements in this crisis that are maybe a model for us in the West or in other regions of the world when it comes to combating COVID. But it is not a model. East Asia or Asia or even a single Asian country is not a model as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to Angela, to all of you for this conversation, this debate. It's been fantastic. It's now time for the final vote. And I'm going to launch this poll now. The question is the same as in the beginning. This pandemic shows East Asia is ready to lead. Do you agree, disagree, or still don't know? And then we'll calculate the difference. Let's now see the results. And I have no idea. I haven't seen them yet. So this is how this works. In the first poll, 60% agreed with the motion and 22 disagreed with the motion. In the second poll, again, 60% agreed with the motion, but 26% disagreed with the motion. So this is very, very close result, but it does mean that while the team arguing in favor of the motion hasn't lost anyone, the team arguing against the motion, Valérie and Angela, have gained 4% of the audience. You've converted 4% who were unclear before, and you've got them all on your team. So this means you win this debate in the Oxford-style format. Congratulations. And of course, thank you also to Bernhard and Se-Woong for taking place. I think this is the closest result by far that we've had so far. So well done to everybody. Thank you so much for having been here. Thank you to the audience for having been here and for asking all these fantastic questions. This is a conversation that is definitely going to continue in many ways, both at Asia Society and elsewhere, and I look forward to doing that. And I do agree with the comment of a participant that this is a very unusual pattern, but such is the nature of Oxford-style debates. They're always good for a surprise.